And I thank God for Pastor Chuck and Nancy and Sam and Charnessa. And again, you have such tremendous leadership here at Father's House Church. And so God bless you. And Pastor Steve there. So, well, I'm going to get into my presentation. Again, I have a website, AmericanMinute.com, and I send out a daily email of history that you can sign up for free. And then I did the book on socialism, the real history from Plato to the present. Now, why Plato? Plato's the first one that talked about everybody owning everything in common. And it sounds nice until you think it through. Somebody has to be in the government handing out all the common stuff. And they're always going to be tempted to give a little extra to their family and friends and to hold back from someone they don't like. And before you know it, it gets discretionary. And the saying is, he who holds the purse strings has the power. So every attempt at everybody owning everything equally always ends up with a deep state bureaucracy passing out favors to their friends with the most corrupt guy at the top, a dictator. Every time that they try to have everybody owning everything equally, it always ends up with those that are in office given favors, right? Insider deals like politicians. And so Plato, why Plato? So he writes in passing of Atlantis, this legendary island that would have existed 800 years before Plato. And it's a highly structured island civilization, and everything's really ordered, and it blew up. And so there is an island in the Mediterranean called Santorini. It's what's left of a volcano. And whether that was Atlantis or whether it sent a tsunami across the Mediterranean that wiped out some place like that, who knows? I went there in college. It's a cute little tourist island, and right along the rim is this Greek village that sort of crawls along this huge rim of this blown up volcano, and it's just adorable. And it's some historians, they try to match the time, and it could have blown up around the time Moses and the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. And it would have sent plumes of fire and smoke that would have caused it to be black for 3 days, or could have had rained the coals and the fire. So remember, it rained fire and brimstone down there. Who knows? But that's an interesting line of thought, but that's not my talk tonight. So, Plato, he talks in admiration of Atlantis, this legendary advanced civilization that's on an island that sank in the sea. And he considered it the perfect structured society. Everybody say structured. And then Plato considered democracy an unstructured society. Everybody say unstructured. So demos means people, cracy means rule, so in a democracy the people rule. And the chief characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's wonderful. And Plato says the state is like a bazaar at which you can buy anything, like a piece of embroidery, the greatest variety of human natures. Such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless, various sort of government, a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder. So whereas Atlantis is ordered, democracy is disordered. And he says the manner of life is that of Democrats. Now he's describing a democracy, but he says every man does what is right in his own eyes, right? And they're tolerating it. And so they're tolerating disrespect in the home. The father gets accustomed to descend to the level of his son and fear them, and the son having no shame or fear of his parents. And then they tolerate disrespect in the classroom. The teacher fears and flatters his students, and the students despise their masters and tutors. And then they tolerate financial irresponsibility. It's a democracy, and they have a treasury, and they just vote to spread the wealth around. Now the treasury's empty. And then they vote to take the money from the rich people. The leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people. And so that now there's no rich people left. And then they tolerate personal immorality. The young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime not accepting incest or any other unnatural union. He is parted company with all shame. Yes, that's what he's talking about. You know, a study was done by an Oxford anthropologist, J.D. Unwin. In 1934, he published a book, Sex and Culture, and he studied Athens, and he studied the Greeks and the Romans and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. He studied 80 major civilizations over a 5,000-year period of history, and he saw trends. And one of the trends he observed was that sexual promiscuity and the loosening of sexual restraints always precedes the collapse of a civilization. And so he said that civilizations go through 4 stages, like a life cycle. You got a plant, it's a little sapling, and then it grows, and then it bears fruit, and then it gets old and worm-eaten and dies. Right? Sort of a life cycle. Well, civilizations have a life cycle. At first, they go through a period of pain and poverty. They go through war, they go through famine, and they make it through, and they work hard, and they become productive, and they work together and become protective and patriotic. And then finally, they become prosperous. And then they want to enjoy their prosperity, and they get pleasure-focused, promiscuous, indulgent, undisciplined, lawless, weakened, and then they get conquered by the next rising civilization. Sort of like an athlete when he's young, he's focused and disciplined, watches his diet, exercises. He wants that prize of the championship. And then finally, he wins. He's the champ for a couple seasons. And then he gets a little lazy, eats fatty foods, doesn't exercise as much, but in his mind, he still thinks he's the champ. And he gets challenged into the ring of competition and gets the tar knocked out of him because in reality, he's a couch potato. And so civilizations, right, they go through this period of pain and poverty and work hard and become productive, and then they become prosperous, and they want to enjoy their prosperity, and they get promiscuous, and they get weakened. And J.D. Unwin even called it a sexual marketplace. He said when women as a whole say nothing happens unless there's a commitment, the guys say, okay, they make the commitment. Then they go out and work hard for their wife, and they become productive. And then the next thing is there's little kids, and the guy becomes protective of his wife and kids. And when all the men of the country are becoming productive and protective, the whole country, rising water floats all boats, the whole country is productive and protective and patriotic and expansionistic and creative and innovative and even militaristic, right? But when the women say there does not need to be a commitment, their water seeks its own level, and you'll have a bunch of guys saying, hey, pleasure time, and they get selfish and self-focused, and they're not as disciplined, and there's fewer kids born to fill the ranks of the military. And when enough of the men of the country act this way, the country's weakened, and then they get conquered by the next civilization. And J.D. Unwin said it's irreversible. Once a nation starts going down this road, it's like a snowball going down a hill. It builds up momentum. Why? Because human nature wants the pleasure, right? And it's very hard to rein it in once the dam is broken. And so we're faced with the attempt to slow it down. And so John Adams writes to Thomas Jefferson, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue? And without virtue, there can be no political liberty. Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy, intoxication, extravagance, vice, folly? No effort in favor of virtue is lost. And so you have Harry S. Truman said, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and anarchy. So Plato. You have Atlantis is structured, democracy is unstructured. They tolerate each other. It's wonderful. And then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are a lot off. Till finally they're tolerating lawlessness. And there's violence in the streets and riots and smashing windows and setting buildings on fire and chaos. And they're just tolerating it. Criminals get let out of jail and they're committing violence and they just tolerate it until finally it turns into this lawless society that's unstructured. And then everybody begins to say, we need someone to come along and restore order. And that's when some governor comes along and he says, I can fix it. I just need some emergency powers. And so Plato says, last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he's a protector. He's full of smiles. And then how does a protector begin to change into a tyrant? He begins to grow unpopular. And so tyrants have two tools in their toolbox, fraud and force. Fraud is they lie to you and take away your freedoms because they're telling you that they're doing it for your own good. Right? I'm going to take away your freedoms, but I'm doing this for your own good. Just trust me, just trust me. Until finally people don't trust him anymore. And the fraud's not working. And the only other tool they have in their toolbox is force. And so they begin to purge their military and their law enforcement of anybody with morals and virtue. All they want is yes men to carry out their will. And so Plato said, if any are suspected of resistance to his authority, he'll have a good pretext for destroying them. And then finally, standing up in the chariot of state with the reins in his hand, a tyrant absolute. Right? So he comes along saying, oh, I want to help you, just give me your rights and your freedoms. And then they begin to take too many rights and freedoms, and people cast it in his teeth, and he has the choice, give up the power, which is not inclined. Plato called him a lover of power, or get rid of the people confronting him. So that's when he purges everything. And then finally, having a mob entirely at his disposal, he's not restrained from shedding of blood. So Plato says that he will send out the mob to destroy his political opponents. And he can stand back and say, well, it's not me doing it, it's just this uncontrolled mob, even though he's behind the mob. And Plato said democracy is doomed to fail because it's based on the people having virtue, and people really don't have virtue. If you give people a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. Now, ancient Israel's attempt to rule themselves without a king, that first 400 years out of Egypt, it worked because they had a big magnet in the sky called God. And people were virtuous because they were accountable to God. Athens did not have that. By Plato's time, Athens had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway. And Plato says, this virtue thing's not going to last. I mean, they'll do it as long as it's the in thing, but if it's to their own personal benefit not to be virtuous, they're not going to be virtuous, and the experiment of self-government is going to collapse. Plato said, if a truly just man lived, the world would crucify him. So this is what he writes, 380 BC. If a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, and will at last be crucified. He writes that 380. So people really don't have virtue. If anybody was born that really had virtue, the world would crucify him. Anyway, so Plato said that because democracy's doomed to fail, the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king. Now let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's say there is such a thing as a nice tyrant, and he wants to do good. He doesn't live forever, and at some point he's going to pass all that power along to some son or grandson that's not a good ruler, but likes his position and is going to become oppressive. What's the Bible example? Joseph in Egypt, a godly man, concentrates power into the hands of the Pharaoh, and he was a nice tyrant. He fed the children of Israel, gave them the best land to Goshen, gave them jobs taking care of his cattle. But then there was a new Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and he used all that concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel, make them slaves, and throw their sons in the Nile River. Right? So God's idea was, let's not concentrate it. Let's separate it. Make it local control. Right? And anyway, so Plato, the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He's the head of gold. He gets to live a little bit extra special because he's keeping it from turning into a democracy, which is going to turn into lawlessness. And so he has his administrators and military, his enforcement arm, and they get to live a little extra too, extra special. They're the arms and chest of silver. So together, the head of gold and the arms and chest of silver, they make up the ruling class. And everybody else is the abdomen of iron and bronze. They are the ruled class. So socialism is a structured society of a deep state ruling class, and then everyone else that's ruled. Now, the ruling class, they're above the law. They're politically connected. They're supported by all those commoners. They can do special things, like getting their hair styled when nobody else can. Remember Nancy Pelosi? And now the ruled class. Yes, everyone is provided for, but nobody owns anything. Everything's owned in common, but it's the ruling class that decides who gets what. He who holds the purse string has the power. There's no families in Plato's perfect structured society. The government decides who gets to have children. And then the government takes the children away from the parents and brings them into Athens, and they are put in government schools where they're socialized, which is a process of getting them to learn how to serve the ruling class. And here's a Michael Rechtenwald, Hillsdale Imprimis magazine, Goal of the Great Reset. And I saw this quote: capitalism with Chinese characteristics, a two-tiered economy with profitable monopolies and the state on top, and socialism for the majority below. Right? It's a two-tiered society. The deep state ruling class, head of gold, arms and chest of silver, and then all the abdomen of bronze common people, and they don't, yeah, it's equal, but they don't own anything. So Plato explained that the tyrant will take these children away from the families, bring them into the city, and teach them lies. He says, when the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order their own city. He likes the order thing. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. Right? So from the very beginning, socialism is they take the kids away from the parents and indoctrinate them. And Plato says they're taught lies, noble lies. We want one single grand lie which will be believed by everybody. But the lies help the tyrant king to stay in power, and since he's keeping it from turning into a democracy, which is going to be chaos and lawlessness, it's okay for them to be taught lies. Could you imagine the government taking the kids away from the parents and teaching the kids lies to maintain the deep state? Now, Plato's perfect structured society on the island of Atlantis inspired in 1516 Sir Thomas More's Island of Utopia. Now, this is shortly after Columbus discovers the New World. And you got these European scholars saying, hey, there's a new world. We can set up new settlements. We get a chance to set up new, ideal, perfect societies. And so this island of Utopia, the word utopia means nowhere. It's a fictitious island somewhere off the coast of South America. And it's written as a Greek dialogue. If you read Plato, it's a conversation between Socrates and somebody else. And it's like this person says something and that person says something. Well, Sir Thomas More writes his Island of Utopia in this dialogue, and it's a conversation with a guy named Hythlodaeus, which means peddler of nonsense. So we have the island of nowhere told us by the peddler of nonsense, and it's Utopia, and it is a perfectly structured society. There's the upper class rulers, lower class commoners. There's free healthcare. There's free identical clothing. Everyone receives free welfare. There's free meals in monastic communal dining halls. Everyone lives in free identical 3-story public housing. There's no locks on doors. There's no private property. All property and goods are stored in a communal warehouse, and it's the deep state ruling class that decides who gets what. There are no taverns, no ale houses, no coffee houses, no places for private gatherings, no privacy. Everyone is tracked everywhere you go with an internal passport. This is the year 1516. He's talking about the socialist state tracking everybody. The government decides everyone's careers. There are no families in Utopia. The government regulates childbearing. Sort of like China's one-child policy. Our Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood founder, she said, no woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. So Plato's structured Island of Atlantis inspired Sir Thomas More's Island of Utopia in 1516. By the way, Thomas More wrote it as a veiled protest against Henry VIII. Henry VIII was Catholic, and then he decided he was going to be Anglican. And he said, everybody has to immediately switch with me. And Sir Thomas More was an important leader, but he was Catholic. And he goes, I'm not going to switch. And Henry VIII had him killed. Anyway, Sir Francis Bacon writes New Atlantis. He calls it New Atlantis because he's directly referring to Plato's Atlantis. And this New Atlantis is a fictitious island in the South Pacific. It is highly structured. Ruling class, commoner class, little more scientific careers because Sir Francis Bacon was a leader in the scientific revolution. But the government dictates everything. Someone wrote a satire on this, and you've read it. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver means gullible traveler. And he's washed up on an island. And he finds out it's highly structured. There is a ruling class. that decides everything. And then there's the rule class that just have to work their jobs. And why is this important? The Pilgrims. It was around this time that the Pilgrims come to Massachusetts. Now, they had no money, and so they went to investors in Europe to borrow money. The investors formed the London Company, and they wanted to get a profit, and they wrote bylaws for their company. And these are guys sitting around the table, okay, we get to design how this new community is going to do and how does it work. And so they put together the bylaws that everything would be owned in common. And they were looking back to Plato, Sir Thomas More, and they said, all profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means shall remain still in ye common stock. And all are to have their meat, drink, and apparel, and all provision out of ye common stock. They tried it and almost starved to death. Right? Half of them died the first winter. Nobody wanted to go out and plant. All right? Their loved ones are dying right and left. They had 102 of them, and there's only like 50 after the first winter. William Bradford says, the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times. Here is William Bradford referring to Plato. The theory, they knew they were finally being the first ones to actually attempt to live out all this theoretical stuff that had been written all the way back to 380 BC, right? Theoretical. Okay, well, everybody owns everything. And they're the first ones to actually try owning it all in common, and it didn't work. He says that the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this sense, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men, who were most able and fit for service, objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc., than the weak man, who was not able to do a quarter what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men, who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc., with the humbler and younger ones, thought it some indignity and disrespect to them. As for men's wives, who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. Let none argue that this is due to human failing rather than to this communistic plan of life in itself. He uses the word communistic. I answer that God, in his wisdom, saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn, obtain a better crop, so they might not continue to endure the misery of want. After much debate, the governor, with the chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea. You plant corn for your household. And he said, so every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means, gave far better satisfaction. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. Right? So they tried it. Okay, let's all own everything together. We're all Christian. Let's own it together. We'll divide it up as we see need. And everybody has the sick kids and husbands dying. And then they said, look, scrap all that. You get your own plot of land. Whatever grows is yours. Right? And they had a great harvest. Now, wasn't the early church socialist? No, the early church was the early church. Socialism is counterfeit early church. And the difference is between the word voluntary and involuntary, and church and government. So the early believers voluntarily sold their lands and laid the money at the feet of the apostles for the church to distribute. They didn't have the government involuntarily take away their land and force them to lay it at the feet of Pilate for the Roman government to redistribute. When Israel entered the promised land, every family was given property. If you own property, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called it being blessed. And you can give away some of your stuff. The Bible called it charity. Lenin said socialism is a transition phase to communism, right? Between capitalism, socialism, and then you got communism. And Karl Marx says communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. So if you don't own any property, how can you be charitable? How can you give away what you don't have? What, are you going to steal from somebody and break the law and now you're a thief? No, God entrusts you with stuff and then gives you opportunities to manifest on the outside the love of God that's on the inside, right? It's a free will thing. And now, didn't Jesus teach socialism? Well, let's look at the parable of the talents. One guy has 5, multiplies it to 10. Another guy gets 2, multiplies it to 4, and then one guy buries it. Sir, here's your talent. I've kept it laid away in a piece of cloth. His master replied, you wicked servant. He said to those standing by, take his talent away from him. Give it to the one who has 10 talents. Sir, they said, he already has 10. He replied, I tell you, everyone who has more will be given, but as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away. In other words, if Jesus were a socialist, he'd say, take from the guy that has 10, divide it up equally. But instead he said, take it from that lazy guy that's not doing anything with it and give it to the guy that's going to do something with it. Right? The hand of the diligent shall bear rule. God doesn't bless laziness. It says, a lazy person turns on his bed like a door on its hinges. A lazy person says, can't go out and plant corn because there might be a lion in the street. It's like, they'll find every excuse not to do something. Now, there is a confusion as to the role of government. In the Bible, God gives commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. The command to the individuals, among other things, includes taking care of the poor, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry. The commands to the family are different. They're mostly relational. Husbands, love your wives. Children, submit to your parents. There's really no commands for the family to take care of strangers. And business commands are do an honest day's work and don't hold back wages. The church is commanded to take care of the poor, and historically they did. They immediately began to feed orphans and widows. And then they began to start orphanage medical clinics and hospitals and schools and all kinds of stuff. And after the, Second Great Awakening in America, they're starting the YMCA, and, George Williams and William and Catherine Booth started the Salvation Army, and it's Christians doing stuff. Did you know there's no command for the government to take care of the poor? The command to the government is the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in health care. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. And we've let them because we didn't know all this. Right? The church started the schools. The whole university system was started by the churches. And then in America, it was every denomination had schools, right? And here's James Madison, who helped write the Constitution. He said, charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government. Here is Representative Davy Crockett, who later dies in the Alamo, but he was a congressman from Tennessee. He says, there's a fire in Washington, D.C., and Congress was going to vote to give some money to the people in Georgetown so they can rebuild. And he says, no, Congress has not the power to appropriate this money as an act of charity. Every member on this floor knows it. We have the right as individuals to give away as much of our own money as we please in charity. But as members of Congress, we have no right to appropriate a dollar of the public money as charity. You cannot give away what's not yours. And the Calvin Coolidge says, it does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it. We need to take care of the poor. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job. It's the church's job and the individual's job. We need to take care of the immigrant. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job. It's the church and the individuals. We need to take care of the sick. We need to do that. We need to do all of that stuff, but it's not the government's job. Right? And historically, the church responded. And you have all these different organizations. Here's Clara Barton, a school teacher, and she starts the American Red Cross. You had people starting things without help from the government. They just saw a need, they got involved, they got Christians to donate. Gerald Ford said, people say, why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money? I look them in the eye and say, do you realize a government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have? Now, what if older fish could tell younger fish to stay away from shiny things dangling in the water? But they can't. So every new generation of younger fish see that shiny thing and they're attracted to it. Right? And socialism is a shiny thing dangling in the water. Free food, free clothes, free education, free welfare, free. Free is attractive, but there's a hook there. You give up your independence. You give up control of your life. So, whenever the church helps people, they have a word for it. It is called disinterested benevolence. You're helping them without expecting anything in return. If they get better off, fine. Maybe they'll help the next needy person that comes along, and this thing called the body of Christ can grow with everybody loving on each other. Whenever the government helps people, it's always in exchange for something. You're in Egypt, you need food. The government says, okay, we'll give you food, but it's in exchange for your cattle, your land, your lives, your votes. When the church helps people, it's personal. The giver experiences the joy of the Lord, of God using them to meet somebody's need. And you've been there, right? And the recipient experiences the love of God through a real person. And they're grateful, and a relationship's established, right? Whenever the government helps people, it's always impersonal. You don't know whose paycheck the money came out of that turned into your welfare check, and you don't care. And instead of being grateful, you look at it as a debt that's owed to you. And if it's late, you get irate. And then there's an interesting phenomenon. Over time, the recipient begins to lose self-esteem. They see other people, living in nice houses and driving cars, and they know that they're just getting free stuff, and they begin to feel bad about themselves. But they want to channel that bad feeling somewhere. They want to blame somebody other than themselves, and they end up resenting the entity that is making them feel bad, which is the government giving them the free stuff. They end up hating the very government that's giving them free stuff, right? So it's an interesting phenomenon that they studied. You give somebody free stuff long enough, they'll hate you. So the Pilgrims, they transitioned from company to covenant. Company was involuntary, and covenant is voluntary. Scrap this thing where we all get this taken away, and no, everybody gets their own stuff. You get blessed, and then you're in a position to voluntarily help your neighbor that's in need. And so it's called the covenant form of government that they borrowed from ancient Israel that first 400 years out of Egypt. You get blessings from God, and you voluntarily take care of your neighbor because you're doing it as unto God. And John Winthrop, the Puritan founder of Massachusetts, said this love among Christians is a real thing, knit together by the bond of love. We must make one another's condition our own. Rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us. It's a voluntary thing. You're caring for your neighbor. Margaret Thatcher, the Decalogue, 10 Commandments, are addressed to each and every person. This is the origin of the sanctity of the individual. Your founding fathers came over with that. They looked after one another, not only as a matter of necessity, but as a matter of duty to their God. So socialism is counterfeit Christianity. True Christianity is they're looking after each other because they're doing it as unto God. And that's why they look back to ancient Israel, and that's why they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. And I may have mentioned this the other night, but Israel, they come out of Egypt, and for 400 years, no king. And so you have all government somewhere on this line, total government, concentrated in the power of the king who rules through fear. The other side's no government unless the people have morals and virtue. It's a sliding scale. The more freedom you have, the more virtue you have to offset it. And I shared this yesterday, right? Didn't I remember that? Okay, and then God's watching everyone, wants you to be fair, going to hold you accountable. And so it creates something in your head called the conscience. And God knew that they would break the law, so once a year they had the Day of Atonement and everybody's forgiven. And that's foreshadowing Jesus. But if you get rid of this God, all you have is a bunch of rules. Some will follow them, some won't. Those that won't are going to yield to their selfish side, and it's going to turn into lawlessness. And you're going to have rioting and smashing windows and setting things on fire, and it's going to turn into chaos, and then everybody's going to say, we want someone to come along and restore order, and that's when the rubber band snaps back into the hands of a king, in ancient Israel's case, the priest stopped teaching the law, and Eli's own sons are sleeping with women in the tent of meeting, and another Levite with a silver graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. And you're saying, what's this Levite doing with the graven image? Isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them. And then another Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe, and this poor concubine is raped to death by sodomites. And by the time you're something about that behavior that appears at the very last stages of a people ruling themselves. This casting off of self-restraint and abandonment to passion turns into lawlessness. And then they all go to Samuel the prophet, and it says every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priest stopped teaching what was right in the Lord's eyes. And it's interesting that this was probably around 1000 BC, the end of the book of Judges, and then they end up getting King Saul and so forth. And then it was around 380 BC that Plato wrote that same thing. And there is some scriptures in the Bible that talked about when Assyria took the 10 northern tribes of Israel captive and sold a bunch of Israelites into slavery, that some of them were sold into Grecia. So there could have been some Israelite captives that went over to Greece and maybe told them about what was happening in Israel, and maybe that's the seeds for Plato. Anyway. But anyway, every man did what's right in their own eyes, turns into an unstructured chaos, and everybody wants some governor to come along and restore order, and that's when they get Saul. And Samuel cries, and the Lord tells Samuel, they have not rejected thee, but they've rejected me. And so God's original plan for Israel was to not have a king, have everybody be taught the law, everybody own private property, everybody share and take care of their neighbor voluntarily, and they didn't do that, and so they end up getting a king. And then Saul turns around and kills all the priests. He rules as a tyrant. And I think I talked about this yesterday. So now this covenant form of government, a century after the Pilgrim's Covenant turned into a social contract. So instead of committing to caring for your neighbor, it's just an agreement with your neighbor. And God turns into a distant God. This comes out of the scientific revolution with Isaac Newton discovering laws of gravity and optics, and Kepler discovering laws of planetary motion, Robert Boyle discovering laws of pressure. And so you have some theologians that say maybe God made everything with laws. And like a guy makes a clock and it's all complicated, but then he goes off on a walk and it's still running. Maybe God made everything, but he's off doing something else. He's not involved in our lives. And he's impersonal. He's distant. The ultimate is he's an impersonal force in the universe. And so you go from covenant to social contract. You go from personal God to a distant God. Well, the century after this, you have the French Revolution. And it's social contract with no God. You get your rights from the group, you're accountable to the group. And the century after that, you have Marxism and socialism where the state is God. And now, let's talk. So let's dissect this French Revolution for a moment. We have a revolution, France has a revolution. Do you know what France got in exchange for helping us get free from Britain? Nothing. No trade deals, no nothing except debt. You send your army around the world and they fight and you get zero in return. They got a lot of debt for helping us. And then they had a couple years where the crops failed. And the people in France thought, gee, if we can just chop off the king and queen's heads, all of our problems will be solved. So they chop off Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, and it doesn't get any better. And so then they chop off the heads of all the royalty. It doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the wealthy. You got money, we don't, you're selfish. It doesn't get better. Then they chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers. You have food and supplies, we don't have food and supplies, you're selfish. You must have gotten it right, wrong. And then they chop off the heads of the hoarders. You got extra food, we don't have enough, you're selfish. Then they chopped off the heads of the clergy, because they're speaking out against the head chopping off stuff. Then they chop off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it, somehow they're to blame. 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris, France. In 1789, in the Reign of Terror, they were chopping off so many heads, they had to invent a nice, clean head chopping off machine called the guillotine. And so the motto of the French Revolution was Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, which means liberty, equality, fraternity. Sounds nice, doesn't it? It doesn't work. Liberty is experienced individually. Fraternity is their word for socialism. It's the group, the collective, the community, the deep state, the socialist government. And equality can be understood two ways. In America, it was equal treatment before the law. In France, it was equity, everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternity, the group, the community, thinks you have too much stuff, it can trample your individual liberty, right? The welfare of the many is more important than the welfare of the one, and so they can trample your individual liberty, confiscate all your stuff, redistribute it, and kill you. Now, while this is going on, the president of Yale is Timothy Dwight, and he writes about the years, so prior to our revolution, we had a Great Awakening revival. Prior to the French Revolution, they had this atheist named Voltaire. And Voltaire, so celebrated for his wit and his hatred of Christianity, formed a systematical design to destroy Christianity and to introduce in its stead a general diffusion of irreligion and atheism. So this is the president of Yale, Timothy Dwight, writing this. He says, the being of God was denied and ridiculed. Possession of property was pronounced robbery. You got stuff, you must have stolen it from somebody, you must have got it wrong. Chastity, natural affections were declared to be nothing more than groundless prejudices. Right? Remember J.D. Unwin, the civilization collapsed when there's sexual immorality? Adultery, assassination, poisonings, and crimes of like infernal nature were taught as lawful, provided the end was good. This is Machiavelli, right? The ends justifies the means. It's okay for you to smash windows of stores and tear things down if your goal is to set up your new socialist utopia. Education of youth, books replete with infidelity, irreligion, immorality, and obscenity. All right, so we're back to teaching the kids, right? And socialize, take the kids away from the parents and indoctrinate them. To destroy us, therefore, our enemies must first destroy our Sabbath and seduce us from the house of God. Right, so you have to get rid of this fear of God, get rid of the knowledge of the Word, and all you have is raw passion, turns into chaos. And whenever you have chaos, the very next step is begging for someone to come in and restore order, and it's a dictator. So people that want to set up a dictatorship first have to create chaos so that people want a dictator. So we have this reign of terror. They tear down statues. Why would you tear down statues? Because they wanted to get rid of everything that was an attachment for the old way of doing things, because they wanted to do something new. So they tore down the statue of good King Henry IV, who was trying to patch up the Protestants and Catholics in the 1500s. And then they dug up the bones of St. Genevieve and trashed them. Who was St. Genevieve? Well, in 450 A.D., Attila the Hun is wiping out cities across Europe with 500,000 soldiers. And this young woman, Genevieve, gets all of Paris to fast and pray. And Attila skips sacking Paris. So she's considered the patron saint of Paris. Well, during the French Revolution, they dig up St. Genevieve's bones and trash them. I mean, we're talking 1,500-year-old bones. They dig them up and trash. They want to tear down statues. They want to tear down graves. It's something called deconstruction, and it's done by every conquering country. You portray a country's past negatively so people emotionally detach from it, and then you get them into a neutral where they don't remember where they came from, and then you brainwash them into whatever future you have planned for them. It's a sales technique. If I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is tell you negative things about the toothpaste you're currently brushing with. You're brushing with that old stuff? Haven't you read the article? It'll eat the enamel off your teeth. You're like, ooh, you're repulsed by it. Now I have you in a neutral. You're open-minded. What are all the toothpastes out there? And then I give you my pitch for this brand new tartar-controlled breath freshener toothpaste, right? So it's a drive neutral reverse. So they go into the classrooms and they tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians. They sold people into slavery. They were chauvinists. They were bad. And these kids are like, ooh, and they're repulsed by the founders. Now you got the kids in a neutral position. They're open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there? And then you give them your pitch for socialism or LGBT, trans, or Sharia Islam or whatever. It's a drive neutral reverse. And Europe went through this. It went from 1,000 years of Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, and Jewish neighborhoods to the French Revolution, secular Europe, with free sex, anything goes. And now it's turning into a socialist Sharia Europe, with Muhammad being the #1 name for newborns. And then the European Italians and Spanish are having, what, 1 kid per couple, and you only have to do that a couple of generations. In each generation, you're cutting your population in half. And so French Revolution, they wanted to erase Judeo-Christian influence on French society. They destroyed religious monuments. They desecrated graves. They prohibited religious meetings. They closed the churches. They banned Christian schools. Church education was outlawed. No private or public worship was allowed. They even chopped off the heads of the nuns. The Catholic Church pioneered hospitals, and they were run by orders of nuns, the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, and they would start hospitals all across Europe. Even Florence Nightingale, the nursing pioneer, said there's no training that can compare with that of a Catholic nun. And the nun's habit was the inspiration for the nurse's hat. Remember they used to wear the little nurse's hat? And so it was synonymous. The nuns were the ones that staffed all these hospitals. The oldest hospital in the world is in Hotel Dieu in Paris, and it's right next door to the Notre Dame Cathedral. It was there since 660 A.D. And so these nuns, it's like you have the government forcing the Obamacare, the nuns to pay into providing for abortion, but they've taken vows of celibacy, you know. And so these nuns were singing Psalms 117, their church song, and they would march them up to the guillotine and chop off a head, and there'd be one less person singing. Then they chop off another head, one less person singing. Then they chop off another head, one less person singing, until nobody else is singing. And then Robespierre was the head of their Committee of Public Safety, their Homeland Security. He actually planned terrorist attacks against the French population to terrorize them intentionally so they would panic and fear and submit to the secular government. He gave a speech, 1794, terror justified. Lead the people by terror. Basis of popular government during a revolution is terror. Terror is nothing more than swift, severe, inflexible justice. So here you have a government saying, we want to hurry up and terrorize our population, get them into a pandemic, get them into fear so they'll give up their freedom as fast as they can and submit to this new order. Ministers and priests and those who harbored them were executed on sight. A similar thing happened in Mexico in 1917. And anyway, there's a rural area. They are hundreds of miles away from the capital at Paris. They think they're safe. But the Federal Army comes out there and kills 300,000 men, women, and children in the Vendée. It is considered the first modern genocide. And it becomes the model for every socialist takeover since. You kill off the old order, the people that are stuck in the mud and won't abandon their faith. You can't re-educate, you just kill them off, and then you can do something new and wonderful. And Robespierre even put a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covered her with a sheet, said, this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. And they didn't want done in the year of the Lord, because it went back to the birth of Jesus, so they made 1792 the new year one. Year one of the Republic. They used that for about 15 years. And then they didn't want a 7-day week, because it went back to the Bible, the book of Genesis, and so they came up with a 10-day week, a decade week. Each day had 10 decimal hours. Each hour had 100 decimal minutes. Each minute had 100 decimal seconds. They said 10 was the number of man because you count on 10 fingers and 10 toes, right? So they made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. And the official meter is there in France by the Louvre, right? They got this piece of metal that's the official meter, and everything's millimeter and kilometer and millimeter. All right. So in France, since there is no God, who decides what's right and wrong? The mob, the state, the collective, the group, the community. And then they had chaos. And out of that chaos, they get a dictator named Napoleon. So, democracies need people having virtue. You give up the virtue, it turns into chaos. In the chaos, you have people saying, we want someone to come along and restore order, and that's when you get a dictator. France had their king, they get rid of the king, and they're going to have democracy without God. It turns into chaos, and somebody comes along and says, I'll restore order. His name's Napoleon. And he takes the crown, puts it on his own head. Right? And so Napoleon conquers Europe. About 6 million people die. I don't know if my mic is there, but Napoleon conquers, and then after Napoleon's banished to the island of Elba and then to the island of St. Helena, Europe's piecing itself together again. And the King of Prussia said, we can't get conquered that easy again. We got to strengthen the state. And so he gets a philosopher named Hegel. And Hegel teaches at the University of Berlin. And he teaches how to get the people to give up their freedoms to the state so you can strengthen the state. And so again, we go from this Pilgrim Covenant to Age of Enlightenment, social contract, French Revolution, social contract with no God, to Marxism and socialism where the state is God. So this is what Hegel wrote. The state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. And you get into his philosophy, he says, well, since there's no God, there's no afterlife, if you are remembered after you die, that's the closest you can come to existing after you're dead. Like the Greeks would at least build a statue of somebody, and then even though they don't exist anymore, they're remembered after their death, and so somehow they thought that was special. And he says, well, what's better than a statue is to create some organization that's living that keeps on going. What's the biggest organization you can create is a government. So your purpose in life is to perpetuate big government. So you exist for the government's benefit. Whereas America's founding fathers said, no, you get rights from a creator. The government exists for your benefit to guarantee to you your creator-given rights. But if there is no creator, your rights come from the state. And what the state giveth, the state can take it away with. And so here's Hegel. The state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. All the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state. Here's Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract. When state says to a citizen, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. If there's no God, the state's the biggest power. And so 100 years later, you got the New York Times. And it writes, Nazi Ministry of Justice authorized physicians to end the sufferings of incurable patients. No life still valuable to the state will be wantonly destroyed. So the state decides if you're going to live or die based on if it thinks that you have worth to it. Pol Pot in Cambodia, the communists that took over, killed a third of his country in the killing fields, the Khmer Rouge. He says, to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss. It's like, unless you're helping me get power, your life is useless to me. And so again, we go Pilgrim Covenant under God, Age of Enlightenment, social contract with a distant God, French Revolution, social contract with no God, to socialism, the state is God. Without God, government transitions from your servant to your master. Right? It's like the policeman in front of your house protecting you to the policeman coming in your house, and you're held captive. Right? The whole purpose switches. Hegel said the state recognizes no authority but its own. It acknowledges no abstract rules of good and bad. What's an abstract rule of good and bad? You mean like the Ten Commandments? Yeah, the state doesn't recognize any of that religious stuff. It is just a power grab by the state. And if you help the state get more powerful, the state thinks your life is useful to it. If you're challenging the state, it doesn't like you, and it'll use its power to crush you. Now, this is interesting because during the Nuremberg trials in Germany, they have these Nazis on trial. And they're saying, well, you killed the Jews. And they said, we were just obeying the state. And the state's the highest authority. Right? Social contract, the state said it's okay to kill Jews, and we were killing Jews. We were just obeying the state. How can you say that's wrong? There's no God to tell me it's wrong. It's the state said it's okay. And so they said, okay, how do we convict these guys? They said, well, what all the countries in the world agree upon supersedes what your particular country agrees upon. So they created the United Nations. But still, if there's no rights from a creator, all they have to do is have Saudi money and bribe a bunch of smaller countries, or Sharia, or the woke Klaus Schwab and, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, with all their trillions. They come into these little countries and bribe them to get their vote. And so they can manipulate the United Nations. So there is no absolute right and wrong and absolute rights. It's just, right? Eisenhower said, in many lands, the state claims to be the author of human rights. If the state gives rights, it can and inevitably will take away those rights. The Founding Fathers had to refer to the Creator in order to make the revolutionary experiment make sense. We had to claim we had rights from a Creator that the king was infringing upon, and therefore we were justified in rebelling against the king. So do your rights come from the government, or do they come from a source higher than the government? Socialism always gets rid of God. They don't want you claim. So in China, they allowed them to have churches, but now they're tightening the screws, and they're saying you can't preach the first 2 commandments, right? Because they don't want a God. They want the state to be the God. It was because all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that men could dare to be free. So we talked about socialism and its origins of everybody owning everything in common. We talked about how it's counterfeit Christianity and the differences between the word voluntary and involuntary. It's the difference between the church distributing stuff with disinterested benevolence, we don't want anything in return, versus when the government distributes stuff, they always want to funnel it to those that can give them favors back or whatever, buy votes. But I always come back to the big picture, and the big picture is that God made us, and He loves you, and He wants you to love Him back. But love, by definition, must be voluntary. If God were to force you to love Him, He Himself would know He's forcing you to love Him, and He would know your response is not a love response, so He'll never force you to love Him. Right. But He wants you to love Him. He loves you. The more you love someone, the more you want that someone to love you back. God loves you infinitely. He has an infinite desire for you to love Him back, but He'll never force you. But He does have plan A and plan B. Plan A is He blesses you so much, you turn to Him out of gratefulness. If that doesn't work, there's plan B. Yeah. All right? He'll hide His face, is what Deuteronomy says, and He'll let you experience the consequences of your selfish actions. And when it gets bad, you turn to Him out of desperation. And then He delivers you. All right? And so He wants you to turn to Him, and it's always better to do the plan A. But the nationwide, I think that our nation, He's blessed us, blessed us, blessed us. And over the years, we've acknowledged Him on our coins. We've acknowledged Him in our pledge. We've had God, but now, no matter how much He blesses us, we're kicking Him out of everything we can think of. If you were God, what would you do? Right? So I think nationwide, but it's always in times of crises that people turn to Christ, right? So, and it's also in times of crisis that God raises up leaders. And whether it's a Gideon, a David, or Moses, it's just our turn. And anyway, so did you get anything out of this? Was this interesting? Well, I have a lot more there, and I mentioned this morning, so I don't know. How many were here this morning? Lots of you were. For those that weren't, I'll give you a quick 5-minute overview. I talked about how in 2003, they focused the Hubble telescope on a spot in the sky where there was nothing. It was a teeny little spot, which is sort of hard because there's so many the stars there. And so, after 11 days, they developed the images, and in that spot where there was nothing was 10,000 galaxies with hundreds of billions of stars in each galaxy. And this is the picture of the Hubble Ultra Deep Space Field. And the thought is that God is awesome. 93 billion light years worth of universe, and it's still expanding at the speed of light. And the thought is, why would He make you? What could you offer a being that is this powerful? Nothing except maybe something. What's a galaxy anyway? It's a bunch of rocks, hot rocks, cold rocks, vaporized rocks, molten rocks. A rock cannot love you. So at some time in eternity past, God said, okay, been there, done that. I can make everything. I would really like someone in my image that could love me. And now it gets interesting because love by definition must be voluntary. The moment it's forced, it evaporates. If God were to force you to love Him in any way, He Himself would know He's forcing you to love Him, and He would know your response is not a love response. So He'll never force you. The second thing is He has to hide Himself behind His creation, because if He ever revealed Himself to you in all of His universe, omnipotent power, your response would be instantaneous, falling on your face like the Apostle John in the book of Revelation. I fell at His feet as dead. And it would be an involuntary response and not a voluntary response. And He says, I can do involuntary all eternity long. He is completely awesome. If He were to let just a glimpse of His awesomeness shine through, boom, you'd be flat on your face. He has to hide His awesomeness in order to give us the opportunity to have a free will. People say, if God's real, why doesn't He show Himself? Because the moment He shows Himself, your free will's gone. In the presence of such power. And the same hiding of Himself that allows us to have free will necessitates that we have faith. So He creates us as free will beings so that we have the opportunity to love Him, hides himself, right? And then the third thing is he's just and he can't help it, which means he has to judge every sin. So if you step out of line, he has to judge you, because if he doesn't judge your sin, he's giving consent to your sin. It's called the rule of tacit admission in common law, and it's in a wedding ceremony. The pastor says, anybody that's against this wedding, speak now or forever hold your peace. If you're sitting there silent, your silence is giving consent to the wedding. If there are sins going on and God is silent and not judging the sin, he's giving consent to the sin. And if God gives consent to one sin one time, he denies himself. He denies his just nature. He ungods himself. He's kicked out of heaven. And he's not going to get kicked out of heaven, and he's not going to deny himself, and he is going to judge every sin. So he could never be loved back, because if he creates free will beings and hides himself so we have a free will, but if we step out of line, he's still got to judge us. So he came up with the plan, and the plan is his own son would become a man, would become the lamb, and take the judgment for all of our sins. So God is just, and that he judges every sin. He's love, and that he provided the lamb to take the judgment for the sin. So this way you and I can approach this universe-creating, omnipotent, all-powerful God and not have to worry about being judged. The lamb is his way to love you without having to judge you. And there's more there, but I'm going to go ahead and pause, and we'll take a break, and then we'll come back for some more.